At exactly 7:48 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, the tropical silence of Oahu was shattered by the high-pitched whine of Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Within minutes, the Pacific Fleet, the iron shield of American democracy, was being torn apart by fire and salt water. 2,403 Americans were lost in those 2 violent hours. But while the smoke was still rising over Battleship Row, half a world away, a different kind of thunder was beginning to rumble. In a small, unassuming factory town just west of Indianapolis, Indiana, the Sunday shift was arriving at the Allison division of General Motors. Speedway, Indiana, was a place built on the smell of burnt rubber and the scream of racing engines from the nearby Indianapolis 500 track. But that morning, as the news of the attack flickered across the telegraph wires and spilled from the speakers of wood-cased radios, the atmosphere inside the Allison plant didn't just change, it solidified. The workers didn't go home. They didn't panic. They gripped their micrometers and wrenches with a new, lethal clarity. They understood that the war wouldn't be won by soldiers alone. It would be won by the precision of the machines they were about to build. By Monday morning, the 12,000 workers already employed at Allison realized they were no longer just machinists. They were the architects of survival. Their mission was centered on a single piece of heavy machinery, the Allison V-1710 engine. This wasn't just a motor, it was a 1,300-pound masterpiece of liquid-cooled engineering. A V-12 Titan designed to scream at 3,000 RPMs while propelling young men through the thin, freezing air above jungles and oceans they couldn't even find on a map. Between 1939 and 1945, this single location in Speedway would churn out over 69,000 of these powerhouses. Imagine the scale. Factories stretching for nearly a mile along the railroad tracks, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for nearly 4 years. The V-1710 would become the primary heart of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the rugged, shark-toothed fighter that held the line during America's darkest hours in the Pacific. When the Japanese Zero seemed like an invincible ghost in the sky, the Allison engine provided the brute force and reliability that kept American pilots in the fight. If you value these stories, the narratives that preserve the memory of the steel, the grease, and the people who built the tools of victory, then subscribe now. We are digging into the forgotten blueprints of history, and it all starts here, in the grease-stained hands of 23,000 workers who turned a racing town into the engine room of freedom. To truly grasp how a Midwestern factory became the beating heart of American air power, we have to look back, long before the first bomb fell on Hawaii. We have to go back to 1915, to a man named James Allison, an entrepreneur who didn't just have oil in his veins. He had a soul forged in the combustion chamber. Allison wasn't just a businessman, he was one of the 4 founders of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. In his world, a fraction of a second wasn't just a measurement. It was the difference between a trophy and a high-speed funeral. In 1915, he established the Indianapolis Speedway Team Company. His goal was simple: to build the fastest, most reliable race cars for the Indy 500. His machine shop, located a stone's throw from the iconic brick track, became a temple of precision. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the races stopped, but the machines didn't. Allison pivoted his entire operation to support the production of the Liberty V-12 aircraft engine. This was his first taste of aviation, a brutal, high-stakes introduction to the world of high-altitude power. When the armistice was signed, most companies returned to their pre-war routines. But Allison was changed. He renamed his firm the Allison Engineering Company in 1921 and spent the next decade refining the Liberty engines, obsessive about its every valve and bearing. However, James Allison never saw the true dawn of the V-1710. He passed away in 1928, leaving his company at a crossroads just as the Great Depression began to choke the global economy. In 1929, General Motors saw something in that small, precision-focused shop that no one else did. They filed an appropriation request to buy Allison Engineering. At the time, the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce hailed it as a victory, a sign that the city would become the aviation center of the nation. They were right, but for reasons far more violent than they imagined. Under GM's massive umbrella, the engineers at Allison were given a mission that sounded suicidal in the middle of an economic collapse: develop a 1,000 horsepower liquid-cooled aircraft engine. This was the birth of the V-1710. The name was a cold, technical description: V for the cylinder layout and 1,710 for the cubic inches of displacement. With a 5.5-inch bore and a 6.0-inch stroke, it was a beast designed to be streamlined. Norman Gilman, the chief engineer, made a radical bet. He believed that while the rest of America was obsessed with bulky, air-cooled radial engines, the future belonged to the slim, liquid-cooled V-12 that could be tucked inside a needle-thin fuselage. It was a vision of aerodynamic perfection that would eventually change the face of the war. But the transition from a racing blueprint to a military titan was anything but smooth. For nearly a decade, the Allison V-1710 existed in what engineers call industrial purgatory, a state where theory and reality are in a constant, violent collision. In the early 1930s, the first prototypes didn't just underperform, they failed spectacularly. When pushed to the 1,000 horsepower mark, the engines became unstable. They leaked coolant, like open wounds. They overheated until the high-grade steel warped. Most damning of all, the United States Army Air Corps, the very organization that had funded its development, looked at the early results and turned away. For years, the V-1710 was a solution, searching for a problem that hadn't yet materialized. While German and British engineers were pouring resources into their own liquid-cooled designs, like the Daimler-Benz and the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the Americans were skeptical. The prevailing military wisdom of the 1930s favored the radial engine, massive air-cooled stars of steel that were simpler and more rugged. Allison was the underdog, a small team in Indiana tinkering with a complex V-12 that everyone else seemed to think was too complicated for its own good. Engineers under Norman Gilman worked in shifts that blurred the line between day and night. They redesigned the cylinder heads. They experimented with new alloys to handle the immense pressure of the 6.0-inch stroke. They failed, they tested, and they tried again. It took 1,000 small victories in metallurgy to save the project from the scrap heap. Then, the geopolitical landscape shifted. By 1936, the clouds of war were no longer a distant threat. They were a looming storm. Nazi Germany had torn up the Treaty of Versailles. Japan had plunged China into a bloodbath. The world was preparing for a conflict that required a new kind of speed. On December 14, 1936, the V-1710 finally took to the sky under the hood of a consolidated XA-11A monoplane. It wasn't a perfect flight, but it was a revelation. For the first time, the US military saw the potential of Gilman's vision. A fighter engine so slim, it allowed for a fuselage that sliced through the air with minimal drag. By 1939, with Europe already engulfed in flames, the purgatory was over. The V-1710 was selected as the standard heart for America's next generation of warbirds. The factory that had employed just 600 people suddenly found itself at the center of a global hurricane. Within months, the floor space tripled to 200,000 square feet. The wager James Allison had made decades earlier was finally being called, and the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the free world. By early 1942, the American military was in a state of shock. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, a masterpiece of Japanese aeronautics, was terrorizing the Pacific. It was light, it was agile, and it possessed a range that seemed to defy the laws of physics. To the Allied pilots flying the heavy Allison-powered Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, the Zero felt like a ghost that could dance around them at will. But in the clouds over Burma and China, a group of mercenaries known as the Flying Tigers was about to prove that a machine doesn't have to be more agile to be more lethal. The P-40 was often criticized for its weight and its mediocre performance at high altitudes. Its V-1710 engine used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger, which meant it struggled to breathe once it climbed above 15,000 feet. But what the P-40 lacked in finesse, it made up for in sheer, unadulterated brutality. It was a flying tank. It featured armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. Luxuries the Zero traded away for lightness. And at the heart of this iron beast was the Allison engine, a power plant that could take a 20mm cannon shell to the cylinder bank and still keep turning. Claire Chennault, the legendary commander of the Flying Tigers, understood the brutal arithmetic of this matchup. He taught his pilots a revolutionary set of tactics. Boom and zoom. He told them, never dogfight a Zero. Never try to outturn them. Instead, use the Allison engine's weight and diving speed to your advantage. Attack from a higher altitude, dive like a falling anvil, unleash the fury of 650 caliber machine guns, and use the momentum to zoom back up or disappear into the distance. The results were staggering. Between December 1941 and July 1942, the Flying Tigers destroyed 297 Japanese aircraft while losing only 4 of their own in air-to-air combat. It was a masterclass in tactical discipline. Back in Speedway, Indiana, the workers read the headlines with a sense of grim pride. They knew that every crankshaft they balanced and every valve they seated was the reason an American pilot survived a high-speed dive that would have ripped a Zero apart. The V-1710 wasn't just an engine anymore. It was the anvil upon which the Japanese air superiority was slowly being shattered. While the P-40s were screaming over the Pacific, a different kind of intensity was boiling back in Indiana. By October 1943, the Allison division reached its human peak. 23,019 workers. In the small town of Speedway, which before the war was just a quiet suburb of cornfields and a racetrack, this was an industrial tidal wave. The population didn't just grow, it exploded. Schools doubled their enrollment overnight, churches ran services around the clock, and the smell of hot metal and cutting oil became the town's permanent perfume. The factory was a living, breathing organism that never slept. 3 shifts, 8 hours each, a never-ending cycle of human energy poured into cold steel. For these workers, the war wasn't fought with maps and bayonets, but with tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. A single burr on a camshaft or a slightly imbalanced crankshaft wasn't just a manufacturing defect. It was a potential death sentence for a pilot 5,000 miles away. They worked with the haunting knowledge that their hands were the last ones to touch the machine that a young man would trust with his life. This era also marked a tectonic shift in the American workforce. As men were drafted by the millions, the Allison women stepped into the light. These were women who had been told for generations that heavy machinery was a man's world. Now they were operating massive lathes, boring out cylinder blocks, and inspecting delicate valve trains with a precision that often surpassed their male counterparts. They wore bandanas to keep their hair away from spinning gears and spent 10 hours a day on their feet, breathing in the fine mist of coolant and metal dust. In the company newsletter, the Allison News, their stories were documented not just as curiosities, but as vital pillars of the war effort. But industrial victory had a dark side. The factory floor was a battlefield of its own. Machine tools are indifferent to human bone. A moment of exhaustion after a double shift could lead to a permanent injury. Accidents happened, fingers were lost, and spirits were tested. Yet the line never stopped. When a letter arrived at the plant from a pilot, one who had survived a dogfight because his Allison engine kept roaring despite losing oil pressure, it would be pinned to the bulletin board. The workers would gather around, grease on their foreheads and exhaustion in their eyes. And for a brief moment, the 23,000 became one. They weren't just building engines. They were building the very pulse of freedom. In the history of World War II aviation, no rivalry is as fiercely debated as the one between the Allison V-1710 and the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. To the casual observer, the Merlin, produced in the US by Packard, was the superior machine. Its two-stage supercharger allowed the P-51 Mustang to dominate the thin air at 30,000 feet. But to dismiss the Allison engine based on altitude alone is to misunderstand the brutal reality of industrial warfare. The V-1710 wasn't designed to be a high-altitude ballerina, it was designed to be a street fighter. General Motors and Allison built their engine on a philosophy of modular versatility. While the Merlin was a sophisticated, tightly integrated masterpiece, the V-1710 was a Swiss Army knife of steel. Its core unit could be mated to a dizzying array of accessories, different turbo superchargers, various propeller reduction gears, and even left or right-hand rotation configurations. This modularity allowed the same basic engine to power the high-climbing, twin-engine P-38 Lightning, the low-altitude P-40 Warhawk, and the unconventional Bell P-39 Airacobra, with its engine mounted behind the pilot. This flexibility came at a staggering logistical cost. There were hundreds of variants, each with its own dash number. Spare parts for a V-1710 T-33 wouldn't necessarily fit a V-1710-81, but this adaptability meant Allison could react to combat lessons in real time. If pilots in the tropics reported radiator failures, Allison redesigned the cooling system in weeks, not years. Furthermore, the Allison was built with automotive-style simplicity, making it incredibly rugged. While the Merlin was powerful, it was also delicate. After the war, racers would often use Allison connecting rods in their high-performance Merlins because the Indiana-made steel was simply stronger. By 1944, the engineers in Speedway had pushed the V-1710 from its original 1,000 horsepower to a staggering 1,600 horsepower in the P-38. They even tested experimental variants that touched nearly 3,000 horsepower. They weren't just building engines, they were exploring the very limits of what internal combustion could achieve. August 15th, 1945. At 11:02 p.m., the night shift whistle at the Allison plant in Speedway sounded different. It wasn't just signaling a break, it was signaling the end of an era. With the atomic flashes over Japan, the frantic pulse of production that had sustained 23,000 workers suddenly flatlined. contracts were cancelled with a stroke of a pen. The thousands of V-1710 engines that were once the most precious cargo in the world became almost overnight industrial surplus. The demobilization was brutal and swift. Employment plummeted from 23,000 to under 5,000 in a matter of months. But the V-1710 refused to fade away into the scrapyards. While the military looked toward the high-pitched whine of the new jet engines, the surplus market opened a second, wilder chapter for Allison's V-12. Complete. Zero-hour engines that had cost the government $8,500 were sold to civilians for as little as $200. This fire sale gave birth to a new generation of American speed freaks. Drag racers, land speed record chasers, and unlimited hydroplane boat racers snatched them up. Legends like Art Arfons and his Green Monster machines used the brute strength of the Allison engine to shatter world records, proving that the steel forged for war was just as capable of chasing glory on the salt flats. But perhaps the most poetic twist of history lies in the sky. Today, approximately 20 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks remain airworthy, preserved by the sweat and capital of dedicated enthusiasts. These flying museums are still powered by the V-1710. In a strange irony, even restored Russian Il-2 Sturmovix and German Focke-Wulf FW-190s, aircraft that were once the mortal enemies of the Americans, now fly with Allison engines because of their legendary reliability and availability of parts. If you stand near the old plant site in Speedway today, you won't hear the roar of the assembly line. The buildings have changed, the faces are gone, and the youngest workers of 1945 are now in their late 90s. But when a restored P-40 makes a low pass at an airshow, and that distinctive 12-cylinder growl echoes across the tarmac, the pass speaks. It's the sound of 23,019 souls who worked through the night. It's the sound of 69,305 engines that held the line when the world was on the brink of darkness. The Allison V-1710 wasn't just a machine. It was a testament to what ordinary people can achieve when the stakes are everything. It wasn't the most famous engine of the war, but it was the one that was there, reliable and ready, one steel roller at a time. The machines have gone silent, but the world they saved is still turning. Thank you for preserving this memory with us.